My name is Liselle Terrett. I'm an associate professor in performance at the University of East London. So I'm delighted to be delivering this presentation on the making processes of a touring live theatre production called Not Fucking Sorry. We often abbreviate it to NFS. So I have a PowerPoint that I'm just going to bring up. So if you could just hold on one moment. Here we are. Brilliant. And I'm hoping to include a 1-minute trailer of the theatre production to sort of highlight a little bit for you to get a little taster of the aesthetic of the production. So this is the theatre company. So it's a collective, and we began. We began back in 2016, and this year in April 2025, we finished a final Arts Council funded national tour of the 1-hour cabaret theatre production. And we've recently had it filmed because we believe that the themes that the show raises are very potent and very current, and we're determined for it to be part of training and policy changing. What I'm very much interested in is how the processes of the making of the production was integral to the success of the production. We're working with, we're all neurodivergent, and some of the cast are learning disabled as well. Okay. So just to begin by reading just an extract from one of our reviews, one of our 5-star reviews from the theatre production. And I'm just going to read this out. I wouldn't usually, but I will do in this case. An act of resistance. In a time when disabled people are being pushed further into precarity, Not Fucking Sorry isn't just important, it's vital. It amplifies voices that are so often silenced, forcing audiences to confront, to listen, and ultimately to act. This wasn't just a performance, it was a rallying cry. And that's really, when we read that, it just feels, yes, this is exactly why we made this piece of theatre. Because we all believe in theatre as protest. We created a space where, as it says in the review, where, so often learning disabled, neurodivergent people's opinions, views, experiences are just made invisible. And we decided to create our own very powerful space and to explore how we can implicate people, how we can get people to start caring for and to feel implicated in their lives and indeed their role in the exclusion that happens still on a daily basis. So, Not Your Circus Dog Collective, that's who we call ourselves. And we're part of another theatre company called Access All Areas, which is also learning disabled and neurodivergent led. We are award winning, which is really exciting. And the work that we create is all about self-representation. We create punk, sexy, testimonial performance that's based on lived experiences and research and acknowledging invisible and silent histories experienced by learning disabled people. We want to name the discrimination, mark the trauma and the shame that's often associated. So this presentation is very much about sort of arguing or saying that, in order to make authentic political theatre that has potency, it needs to be co-led and in fact led in many ways by learning disabled people. learning disabled people need to have the opportunity to connect with their own histories and culture. And, you know, equally, we have got to acknowledge that more than not, learning disabled people do not have any opportunities to take on any leadership roles. So I feel that's absolutely essential in the structure and the sort of leading that leads our rehearsal processes. We are constantly searching for an equity that respects everybody in the room so that we can actually start creating authentic, political, artistic work. Now, there was two sort of frameworks that I have used to talk about some of the strategies that we used in the rehearsal room. And one of them, and I'm just going to, move this on. One of them, let's hope this is the right one. These are just some of the reviews, just to show you that it was, we've had several national tours and it's been very well received. One of the frameworks is called the Code of Silence, or the Blue Code of Silence, which is a term that's often used in the police force that basically names how important, vital information or events that are happening are actively, there's a sort of a silence code that basically means that people cannot name them. So if people are breaking the law in the force or misbehaving, the rule is you keep quiet. And I'm very interested in using that in terms of what happens in terms of indirectly or directly silencing learning disabled people in our more creative spaces. In addition, I also use Michael Rothberg's The Implicated Subject alongside the Code of Silence. And the implicated subject is when the implicated subject is very much about, as it says here, is about, you know, recognizing that, you know, your everyday person might not be the lead perpetrator, or may not be the one who's committed a crime against, in this case, a learning disabled people. However, what we are saying, if we remain silent, we are basically condoning the injustice, and therefore we participate indirectly into continuing the discrimination. So, you know, Michael Rothberg's framework asks us to wake up and to understand, as I say, how each of us is implicated and entangled in this systemic form of injustice that so often we've grown up with. And I think you call that passive inheritance, whereby through our social positions, economic positions, roles, institutional affiliations, I'm just born into a certain passive inheritance, a certain role. However, if I see myself as an implicated subject, I become accountable for my role as gatekeeper. And therefore, I cannot pretend neutrality and deny the structures that have actually favoured me. And that goes back to, you know, I identify as neurodivergent. I've have my own challenges and struggles. However, you know, I'm doing this presentation. I work as an associate professor at University of East London. I have lots of privilege. And therefore, you know, I strongly believe that as I work with marginalised people who have experienced so much trauma, I am absolutely committed to calling out the discriminatory injustice within my own performing arts field that I'm part of, as a facilitator, as a director, as a lecturer. I believe that I have absolutely no choice but to make a stand. Otherwise, if I don't, then all I'm doing is reinforcing and continuing the ableism to my advantage. So in a way, I'm talking about being a practitioner that is constantly reflexive, constantly really aware of my own how I continue it. And therefore it makes me think about, okay, if that's the case, my unconscious biasness, what structures do I need to put in to really keep an eye on me and on the marginalized group that I am privileged to work with. So, as I said, this presentation is just going to give you a little insight into some of the structures that we put in that informed our making process that led to Not Fucking Sorry. And in fact, I think before that, I'm just going to show you our trailer. Let's see if this is the right one. Oh, no, not yet. This literally just tells you a little bit how, we really are fighting against, pulling against the medical model and the pity model of disability. So it's very much seeing learning disabled people being denied a human right to live freely and with equity. The show is very much about, as I say, it's about how do we wake the audiences up? How do we get them to feel implicated? Well, we do that by finding a similar, what's the language that connects us? So we use various forms of popularized media to do that, so that we can show and so that gradually what happens in the rehearsal process is that my co-devisers, my learning disabled and neurodivergent fellow colleagues gradually realize they are not to blame. It's the system that's to blame. And indeed, of course, it's, the system is very much around sort of recognizing non-disabled people. So it's really about turning the gaze. So here we are. This is just a little, the sound isn't great, but it's the 1-minute trailer that will give you an insight into where we ended at in terms of confidence and how we use performance to really challenge the public.
So, what do you fuckers want?
I drink and I smoke.
I love to swear.
I want you to feel it too.
When I see an ugly person like you, I point and stare.
I cheat and I lie.
I love to flirt, and I'll make you sigh.
I watch porn.
I read filthy magazines.
I stay up way too late.
I am sick and tired of being your circus dog, and we are not going away.
See, I want you to feel it too. So just listen to me, baby. And I want you to know that.
These are the actors and some of our support workers, which is what I'm going to be talking about as well. We always have support workers in the room with us. Just see what the next, okay, there we go. I'll just keep it on there just now. So into the rehearsal room. In the devising and rehearsal room, we work to dismantle and break the code of silence. We slowly build trust. We practice mutual implication, mutual responsibility, respect and care, whereby we acknowledge the inequalities present in the room as we are all implicated subjects. For example, Stephanie in the centre here. Stephanie is a Down syndrome artist. Stephanie surprises people, not because she is unexpectedly capable, but because we are taught not to expect. In our rehearsal room, we always have a number of creative support workers, sometimes 3 at least. In fact, usually about 3. There's 3. And it is there, and that's non-negotiable, okay? And it is their job to keep an eye on the power dynamic in the room, a sort of conscious raising in action, embedded in the practice, to make sure that any overt or indirect subconscious manipulation or silencing of the actors, the learning disabled or neurodivergent actors that may be happening, is called out in various forms at various times. And all of the support workers have all received training in being support workers. And we also embed constant reflections as well. This lens of the implicated subject has helped me to re-examine the assumed role, the traditional role of the support worker, which often we see maybe in day centres, in schools, in hospitals. And I believe that there's a real misuse of this role, or a sort of limiting, belittling perhaps even of this role. And I feel that actually, it can fuel the pity model of disability, which becomes an assumed way of being. So that instead of the creative support worker supporting the learning disabled to understand the instructions from what is expected from them, from the facilitator, director, in other situations as well, the teacher, the doctor, the nurse, etc. We absolutely go against this, whereby the support worker is actually there to ensure that the facilitator, director, teacher is actually accountable to the learning disabled person. So that we begin from the learning disabled person's lived experience, a little bit like Paulo Freire's Naming Your World, where it's very much around recentering the learning disabled, the neurodivergent person's lived experiences, so that they are centred, they are positioned as experts in the room, so that the hierarchy is broken, and that we have to work within an equitable and accessible space that allows for authenticity and inclusiveness. So it's not about the director deviser having this sort of special knowledge. It's actually about bringing that status down so that we're all working on the one level. However, it's also about recognising the injustice that has happened, that these brilliant people, that has to be brought into the room as well. So really what we're doing is we're creating a space of transparency, of accountability, that ultimately we're driving towards an ethical vigilance, that actually, because we're trying to remove that hierarchy, we all take accountability for. And so there's a lot of training that's involved in that, which I'll go on to later on. Keeping on this note, I'd like to just stick on to the gatekeeper. So there's a wonderful academic and practitioner, Kelsey Acton, who has seen the show many a time, and we talked a lot about trauma and this idea of silencing. And Kelsey said, the trauma learning disabled people experience is often used as an excuse not to talk about the trauma, whereby in support roles, the ones in support, the creative support workers, they feel by silencing the trauma that they're doing good. Whilst actually, of course, what they're doing is just reproducing the code of silence, belittling, as I said before, ignoring the lived experiences. And so instead, what they're doing is they're policing that silence. And instead, they're creating a cheerfulness for comfort for the non-disabled person, so that the pain of trauma is softened, which is often seen, I think, as a good thing. It's well-meaning. It's seen as protecting the learning disabled person, but actually it's protecting the non-disabled person, because it becomes, as we know, normalized. It becomes part of the system. The silencing of learning disabled people, the ignoring, the dismissing of their testimonial lived experiences. And so even when it becomes part of history, we just sort of sideline it, or it's not taught. So Instead, in our rehearsal room, we actively embrace disability, the history of disability, the strength that disability brings, the agency of, and that leading to more confidence, the pride. So we move away from pity or shame, however uncomfortable that is for the non-disabled person. We encourage everybody to stop apologising. When we made a game in our rehearsal room, because everybody kept apologising, I'm sorry, hence, I'm not fucking sorry. So we make a game that we're not allowed to apologise. I'm not sorry. I'm not fucking sorry. Because we start to move, and we also, brought in swear words using a microphone, really opening those sort of cages of control, of silencing, which was about reclaiming power, voice, reclaiming anger, reclaiming our emotions. And so that becomes an embodied resistance to that silencing. I mean, even on tour, the actors, it never quite finishes. The actors perform that strength, because of the work that we've achieved. But actually, the sort of the damage, the years and years of infantilization, of belittling, of being ignored has such a big impact. I mean, we know this, that the actors find it very difficult to receive praise, which again, we make a game out of. So we sort of just continue it. So I'm just going to move on to the next slide. So the next number of slides are just lovely photographs from some of the scenes, some of the acts in the show. And this is we do a parody of a daytime television show in the UK called Countdown. And we use it to expose the language and the embeddedness, the embedded sort of dehumanization and justification of learning disabled people. But we use humor and parody to do this, to seduce and to wake up the audience. Where am I? So we basically, I think this is the point actually. So our devising and rehearsal process is very much about shifting the disabled actors from the ones being stared at to the ones who become the starers, so that they have control, that they can change, react, respond to those structures that have been imposed on them, so that they take control of the narrative, and ultimately the audience become accountable to the actors. So now I just want to sort of just bring in the idea of role. So of course the actors take on a multiple of roles actually in the show. They perform themselves or an aspect of themselves, but they're constantly stepping in and out of numerous roles as well. But the whole preface of the show is they're there as a gang, really, as the dogs. And very powerful, and it's a very powerful act what they're doing. And in order to take on that sort of very high status role, and to talk very directly out to the audience, again takes a lot of work. So we use role in the rehearsal room as well as on stage, as well as in these sort of liminal spaces as well. We use role as a mechanism in rehearsal room, actually more than just to improvise and to perform, but to offer an emotional distance from the work that was being created, because it is horrific, the history. It does continue in our actors' everyday lives. So, we, even just now, I've taken on a role so that I can emotionally sort of separate my own sort of personal things to this presentation. And that'd be something that I learn. That would be something that I've learned through my own training and education. So, for people who haven't experienced that, we need to actively be very proactive and bring that very visibly into the room and name it. So we use role to offer emotional distance, to maintain protection, so that the actors can become researchers, to engage in primary and secondary research, to become co-writers, devisers, to bring in their own lived experiences, but also to become witnesses, to acknowledge and celebrate their survival and what they've been through. So the idea of role becomes a weapon. And as I say, we use it during devising, but we also used it on tour, not just on stage. We use it backstage, after the show, in the bar, in role when they do their bows, in role. Because yes, for protection, but also again, you know, we acknowledge, as I say, the gap, the trauma is so big that we have to take on these roles. And once you've seen the shows, hopefully that will all make sense. So for example, actually, before each production, everybody would go into role as the dogs, including the support staff, including myself as well, whereby we just talked about why we're doing the show. What is it about the show that makes it so urgent to get on? Why is it so political? And the actors in role would talk about that, about just improvise it, why they're doing it, and the risk of doing it, how they're really putting themselves out there, but they just have to do it because enough is enough. Being in and out of role gave everyone permission to hold on to their lived experiences. And also to proactively use that in character as the dogs, not as pity, but as very powerful survivors, as leaders, as facilitators, as disruptors of the show. So just to close, because this can only offer a little sort of tip into this sort of process. Not fucking sorry. It was in the form of a sort of cabaret style show with a narrative, where we took a national charity TV fundraising organisation called Children, I've put here Child in Need, but Children in Need, that's very much about all the poor disabled people, and we really turned that around. Do not pity us. So this DIY form of entertainment gives the actors permission to use direct address, to take control, to tease, to seduce, to celebrate their own way of expressing themselves, how they move, how they talk, how they dance, how they look. And it totally disrupts the assumed passive relationship of them as neurodivergent learning disabled people, but also that idea about the passive audience. It's about waking up the audience and using that potent space in between the actor and the audience. For example, as soon as the audience enter the theatre, each of them is given a green token to participate. They're told they have to use that and make a choice later on in the show. The audience cannot remain untouched. They cannot hide, just like the learning disabled person, whereby the game is part of their everyday lives, experienced all the time without their consent. Stephanie, at the very beginning, is the only actor on stage. She's got her middle finger up and she smokes a pretend cigarette, wearing a long black hooded coat. Emma and DJ sit in the front row, hidden, and they suddenly appear when the Shame on You music begins for their first seductive dance. Before the show, as I say, they're sitting in the audience, and Staying Alive by the Bee Gees is on, whilst our final actor, Adam, is like a bouncer coming down through the auditorium, winking quite powerfully at the audience. The lights come up, the performance begins, the first reveal starts. They take off their coats and they perform Shame and point, Shame on You, in a very teasing way. They've immediately taken over, challenged and broken the code of silence. Seizing control, led by Emma, the lead MC, welcomes everybody to their takeover cabaret. And Emma directly names the marginalisation they have faced, and she shouts out to the audience, you are all a bunch of twats, using parody and seduction that eventually moves into testimony. The audience laugh nervously. The performers perform humour, sarcasm in defiance. They demand that the audience engage with them as adults and not as objects of pity or shame. Just as a final note, I'm reminded here of Augusto Boal's Rehearsal for a Revolution, which can only happen with us, not without us. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to having a conversation about the theatre production.